Hey everybody, welcome back to my study. I know it's been a while since I've done one of these teaching videos because my life has been very busy and I try to find time wherever I can on my day off or in an afternoon after lunch or something to try to film these things, and I just haven't had much of it lately. But today I want to talk about John Wesley's revision of the Book of Common Prayer, and particularly about the lectionary and just the lectionary tradition more generally as it's been received in Christian churches and how we practice it. And if you go to my church, for example, on a Sunday morning, we'll typically have 2 Bible readings and then part of a psalm sometimes in the call to worship. And very often, those are taken from what's called a lectionary. A lectionary is basically a cycle of readings where there are certain readings assigned for each Sunday of the year. And this is something that Christian churches have done pretty much since the beginning. In fact, lectionaries were used by the ancient Jewish synagogues, and so this is one of those Jewish practices that pretty much got carried over into early Christianity. It's one of the many ways that our Christian faith is actually very Hebraic or Jewish in its nature. And so we have these traditions of lectionaries, and we've got lectionaries from the early church and fragments of lectionaries. And many scholars believe, if you go read the account in Luke chapter 4 of Jesus preaching in the synagogue on the Sabbath day, when he reads where it says in the scroll of Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me," that Jesus is actually preaching from the lectionary, that was a lectionary text used in the synagogue on that particular Sunday, or Sabbath day rather. And so this is a tradition that was carried into Christianity, where we have assigned readings for certain days, and very often, as we move through the different holy days and seasons of the church year, the assigned readings reflect the character or the themes of that season or that holy day. And so that kind of makes sense, right? You're going to read about the birth of Christ at Christmas. You're going to read about the resurrection or the meaning of the resurrection on Easter Sunday or during the season after Easter. So Methodist churches and United Methodist churches and many Wesleyan churches today do follow lectionaries, sometimes a little more loosely than others. And this tradition is something that was passed on to us by John Wesley, who was the Anglican priest who was the principal leader, well, not the only one, but the principal leader of the early Methodist revival movement within the Church of England. And John Wesley, as I've talked about in these other videos about his version or revision of the Prayerbook, loved the Book of Common Prayer. This is the Book of Common Prayer of the Church of England, the Anglican Church. And the 1662 edition is the one that Wesley would have been using on probably a daily basis. And if you've got one of these handy, you can certainly look at it on the internet for free. There's a section that in this book begins on page 47 called the Collects, Epistles, and Gospels to be used throughout the year. And a collect is simply a prayer of the day or a prayer of the week. And so for each day, and the lectionary begins with the first Sunday of Advent. Advent is the beginning of the Christian year. So the church year kind of starts over around the end of November, beginning of December every year. So you've got the collect, which is the prayer of the day, which is supposed to kind of collect our thoughts and desires and needs into kind of one very succinct prayer. Then you've got the epistle lesson, the first reading, which is in this prayer book and in Wesley's prayer book, almost always taken from the New Testament. And I'll come back to that in a minute. The first reading here is from Romans, and then there's a gospel reading from the Gospel according to St. Matthew. And then you've got the second Sunday of Advent. There's a collect and an epistle and a gospel, and so on. And it goes through the seasons of the year. Now, the lectionary in the 1662 prayer book is a one-year lectionary. So the same readings are used year after year after year. So if it's the third Sunday of Lent, or if it's the fifth Sunday after Easter, every single year the readings are going to be the same for that Sunday. And then there are readings in here for weddings, funerals, particular holy days and days of fasting or special observance. And actually, this prayer book is it's over 600 pages, and about 200 of those pages are just those Bible readings. I mean, a huge chunk of the prayer book is actually nothing other than the King James Version of these Bible passages. And then you also have the book of Psalms in here. So a lot of this book is just the Bible. John Wesley's revision of the prayer book, the Sunday service book, basically carried over the 1662 prayer book lectionary. And you can see this, and this is John Wesley's The Book of Common Prayer. This was a hard copy version of Wesley's Sunday service book that was put out just a couple of years ago. It's fairly recent. It was a pretty limited printing. I don't know if you can still buy these new. But you see the same pattern. So it says the collects, epistles, and gospels to be used throughout the year. And then there's the first Sunday of Advent. There's the collect. This collect is also found in the United Methodist Hymnal. Actually, it's... can't remember what it's called, but it's the one about feeding on the Scriptures. Grant that we may hear them and read them and mark them and inwardly digest them. And then there's the epistle from Romans and the gospel from Matthew's gospel for the first Sunday of Advent. And the actual lectionary that both Wesley's prayer book and also the 1662 prayer book use was, of course, revised at the time of the English Reformation, but for the most part, it's actually much older than that. This is called the Western or Latin lectionary, and some scholars think it might go back as far as like the 9th century, 10th century. So it's more than 1,000 years old that Christians throughout the years have been using the same gospel passages and epistle passages on Sundays. And this is something that was before the 20th century. This was kind of an ecumenical usage. So Wesley's prayer book included this lectionary. As I said, the Anglican prayer book includes this lectionary. But if you went to a Lutheran church in Germany, speaking German, if you went to a Roman Catholic church, odds are you've got basically the same lectionary used across the Western churches, the ones that were using lectionaries at all. And it was a lectionary that Christians had been using for like 1,000 years. So that's a pretty remarkable convergence, or just something that we share in common across our traditions. Now, Wesley's lectionary, and I've got this other edition of Wesley's Sunday service book that just has, it doesn't actually have all the Bible passages printed out, it just has references. So there's the collect, and there are the two passages, and there's a collect and the two passages. And Wesley's lectionary, he basically copies it, cut and paste from the 1662 prayer book. However, based on his own experience in Georgia, John Wesley and Charles Wesley had been missionaries in the British colony at that time of Georgia. And they found that they tried to do everything kind of by the book and run their church and their mission the way an Anglican church would be run. And they found that did not work very well. And they, because of that, Wesley had this idea that many of the holy days, many of the kind of more elaborate ceremonies, and just a lot of the stuff in the prayer book just didn't really work. What they needed in the colonies, he felt, was something that was simple and flexible. And throughout his revision of the prayer book, what you see Wesley doing is not really changing things, but mostly omitting things and cutting stuff out, stuff that he thought was unnecessary or superfluous. It was above and beyond what's just the bare necessities. He cut all of this out. And not always for theological reasons, but just because he wanted it to be really a bare-bones prayer book that was simple and flexible, because based on his experience in Georgia, he thought that's really what they needed. And you see in his lectionary a pretty radical, in some ways, revision, because he cuts out most of the holy days and seasons of the church year. So we've got Advent and then Christmas, the Sundays of Christmas, but instead of having 2 Sundays of Christmas and then going into the season of Epiphany, he drops the Feast of Epiphany, and he continues simply to count Sundays as Sundays after Christmas. And so he's got the 4th Sunday, 5th Sunday, 8th, 10th Sunday after Christmas. However, the 11th Sunday after Christmas in Wesley's lectionary is actually the first Sunday of Lent in the Book of Common Prayer. But because Lent is a season that moves around depending on the date of Easter. Wesley's prayer book is got it fixed based on the date of Christmas. And so what you would have if you actually tried to use Wesley's lectionary is you would be doing the readings for Lent and praying the collects that were intended for the Sundays of Lent. And some years that would be during Lent, and some years it would be before Lent, and some years, it wouldn't quite work. And because he's cut a couple of the holy days out, in some years it's actually possible for Wesley's lectionary to run out of Sundays when there's still 1 or 2 Sundays left in the Christian year, or in the season of what we would call Epiphany, the season before Lent. And so there are some, I don't think Wesley really went through a calendar and really worked out, like, if Easter falls on this date, how's that going to affect this lectionary? So there are some things about it that just don't quite work. But besides the omitting of the holy days, I mean, if you just retitled some of these days, as I've made some notes in mine, like here starts Lent, this should be the season of Epiphany, and you allow the Sundays in Lent to move around, then the lectionary works fine, and it's consistent with the historic Anglican practice. So Wesley's lectionary, I don't know how much it was used. Like a lot of the elements of Wesley's prayer book, I think some Methodists, particularly in the cities on the East Coast, actually did use this stuff, very much like an English parish church back in England would have done. But because so much of the United States really was frontier, they felt that the Methodist preachers in the very end of the 1700s and the 1800s, a lot of them felt that even Wesley's bare bones prayer book was still too much and too much structure, and they wanted more flexibility. And so I don't know to what extent this lectionary was utilized until really later in the 1800s, when the U.S. was kind of a more settled country. Now, the one-year lectionary you also will find in like more recent editions of the Book of Common Prayer. This is the 1928 Book of Common Prayer of the Episcopal Church, or I think as it was more commonly known back then, the Protestant Episcopal Church. And it's very much like what you have in the 1662 prayer book of the Church of England and in John Wesley's service book. It's the one-year lectionary, the classic Western lectionary that goes way back into the Middle Ages. Now today, there are churches, traditional Anglican churches are still using that one-year lectionary. I don't know what the Lutherans are doing, but most of your Methodist churches and a whole lot of Anglican and Episcopal churches are using a 3-year lectionary. And so I'll tell you a little bit how that happened and why that happened. And I think it started with Vatican II, the actual 3-year idea of the lectionary. I know I've got some books of worship, Methodist Book of Worship, the old Book of Worship from the 1960s, and I've got an even older one from like the 30s or 40s, and they both contain a one-year lectionary for Sundays, and in both of them, it's substantially different from the lectionary in Wesley's service book. So they were tweaking the lectionary, no doubt, but it was still a one-year lectionary. And in the course of time, what has basically happened is that there was the one-year lectionary, 2 readings per Sunday. So, and then it repeats every year. So it's not a whole lot of the Bible that you really get in the Sunday lectionary. The idea in the Church of England, certainly, in the Book of Common Prayer, was that most of your Bible reading was going to happen not on Sunday, but on weekdays. And there was the daily office, and I've done videos on the daily office, the services of morning and evening prayer. And there was a daily office lectionary that would take you through the New Testament and through the Old Testament pretty much in their entirety. And I believe that you would go through the New Testament twice and the Old Testament once every year. So it was a lot of Bible reading if you do the whole morning and evening office. And so the idea was people were going to learn the Bible by listening to the daily office readings. And so on Sunday, the idea of the lectionary was not to teach people the Bible or you know, a broad swath of it, but just to focus on certain themes for the holy day. By the time you get to the 20th century, I don't know what's happened, but our culture has shifted. I think Christians are maybe just less committed and dedicated than they used to be. The radio's been invented, television has been invented by the middle of the 20th century, and people are not reading their Bibles as much, by and large, in the English-speaking world and in other places too, I think. And so, and people are not attending the daily office. I don't know if they ever attended it a lot, but certainly they're not in the 20th century attending it a lot on a daily basis, morning and evening prayer services. And so the average churchgoer, even if they're a very committed churchgoer, they're only probably hearing scriptures in church on Sunday mornings. And so there was this desire in the 20th century to make a bigger Sunday lectionary with more Bible reading as part of the worship service. And so I believe, and again, if you guys know more about this, you can correct me, but I believe this really officially got going at Vatican II, the Roman Catholic Council of the Church of Rome, that was designed to sort of renew and reinvigorate, and some people might say, update the practices of the Roman Catholic Church. And in many ways, as I see it, Vatican II actually brings Roman Catholicism closer to what the Protestant reformers had been asking for all along. The Vatican Council creates or authorizes the creation of a 3-year lectionary cycle. And instead of just having 2 readings, there are now 4 for each Sunday. There's an Old Testament reading, a New Testament reading, a psalm from the Old Testament, and then a gospel. So 4 readings for every Sunday, and then a 3-year cycle of readings. And so a much more of the Bible gets included in the Sunday lectionary. And I think this is kind of a way of trying to compensate for the fact that people are not attending the daily office, at least not large numbers of people, and are not reading the Bible and learning the Bible as much in the homes, families around the dinner table reading the Bible like had happened in previous generations. And so you might say that this is a kind of a concession, but to our lack of discipline as Christians. But certainly there was this desire, we want to get more of the Bible in front of people on Sunday mornings. And so the 3-year lectionary was created. And then the Protestants said, hey, that's a great idea. And so they also began creating 3-year lectionaries. And so if you've got a modern Book of Common Prayer, a 1979 prayer book from the Episcopal Church, or the 2019 prayer book of the Anglican Church in North America, there is a 3-year lectionary. So you got the first Sunday of Advent, and here's readings for year 1, and readings for year 2, and readings for year 3, and there are typically 4 readings. And then the United Methodist Book of Worship also has something very similar. This is called the Revised Common Lectionary, and it's the same thing. You've got a 3-year cycle, 1, 2, 3, and you've got usually 4 readings for every Sunday. And it's kind of interesting as I compare these lectionaries. There are differences. And I think the Roman Catholic lectionary and the Anglican lectionary tend to pick Old Testament readings that kind of key in with the New Testament or the Gospel reading, so they're thematically connected. So the New Testament and the Gospel is kind of setting the tone for all the readings of that Sunday, and then the Old Testament kind of piggybacks on that or connects with it. The Revised Common Lectionary, and this is used by Methodists, certainly Presbyterians, some Baptist denominations use the Revised Common Lectionary. I think maybe some Lutherans do too. So this one is broadly used, ecumenically used. And some of you, if you are Episcopalian, I would love to know more about this. I believe a few years ago, like 10, 15 years ago, the Episcopal Church switched from the Prayerbook lectionary, which was a 3-year cycle, to the Revised Common Lectionary. And they did it for one 3-year cycle and then switched back. And I guess they decided they didn't like it. The Revised Common Lectionary is different because the Old Testament passages are often simply going a little bit more sequentially through books of the Old Testament or through kind of highlights of books of the Old Testament. And while there often are thematic connections to the gospel reading or the New Testament reading, that's not always the case. And so you get much more in the Revised Common Lectionary of like, we're going to spend 6 weeks or 8 weeks just going through Genesis or just going through 1 Samuel, where you really don't get that in the Anglican lectionary, and I don't think in the Roman Catholic lectionary. I think they're much more, the Old Testament lesson just jumps all over the place because it's kind of serving the New Testament lesson. So there's kind of two different philosophies about using the lectionary, and this one is obviously what I am more familiar with as a United Methodist pastor. This is what I have preached through, I guess about 3 times now, 4 times. How many years have I been doing this? And so I kind of like that it goes through the books sequentially, because you can be like, let's do the life of David for 6 weeks and just follow the lectionary, or let's work our way right through Galatians or something like that. But it is a little bit different philosophy. So if you look at like websites or service bulletins or whatever in a Roman Catholic church and an Episcopal church and a United Methodist church, very frequently, in fact almost always, the gospel lesson will be the same in all 3 lectionaries. Very frequently, but not quite as often, the New Testament lesson, the epistle lesson, will also be the same, or it'll be very close to the same. But the Psalm and the Old Testament lesson are almost always different. Sometimes they are the same as well, but very frequently they're not the same. Between the Revised Common Lectionary, the Book of Common Prayer Lectionary, and then the Roman Catholic Lectionary. So that's kind of an interesting way where we're in some ways on the same page on Sunday mornings all over the world, reading the same gospel lessons, but in other ways we're looking at other lessons that are different. So that's kind of the sort of overview of the lectionary and how we got it. And I know there are pastors that love preaching the lectionary. It's kind of simple. You just look and see what are the texts for this week, and you pick 1 or 2 of them and you roll with it. I know there are pastors that don't like the lectionary. A very prominent United Methodist pastor has written a book on preaching that I think is actually a pretty good book. His name is Adam Hamilton. And he says in that book that there are certain seasons of the year, like Advent, where he does tend to use the lectionary, but for the most part, he does more sermon series because he thinks that's really, that's more sort of seeker-sensitive, and that's more focused on people's felt needs. We start with what people are thinking about and feeling already, and then bring the Bible to that instead of starting with the Bible and trying to bring the people. There are different philosophies, but a lot of churches that are kind of like megachurch, or they're emulating the megachurch model, they're less enthusiastic about the lectionary, it seems like to me. I have kind of a love-hate relationship with the lectionary. The discipline of reading through lots of the Bible, I think about, I've heard different numbers thrown out there. My sense of it, because I do keep track of I have a spreadsheet of every sermon I've preached and what scriptures in canonical order. My guess would be it maybe covers between 30 and 45% of the whole Bible if you do all the readings every week. And I think there's value to that. And the lectionary, as many people point out, makes the preacher preach on texts that they may not be as comfortable with, or they might struggle with a little bit, or it's just not their favorite text that they just love. Because if you're in a church that doesn't use a lectionary, you can fall into this trap if you're not careful, if the preacher's not careful, of kind of preaching his 25 or 30 favorite Bible passages like over and over and over and over and over again. Although there are some passages that do show up in the lectionary like over and over again, and it's like, wait, this just showed up 6 weeks ago, and here it is again, Psalm 23. So even in the lectionary that can happen, but you do have more of a challenge to preach on more of the Bible over the course of 3 years. I have heard people say that they actually prefer the 1-year lectionary, both because it has that older kind of pedigree. This is the lectionary that John Wesley used, the lectionary that Martin Luther used, the lectionary that Thomas Aquinas used. It's the same lectionary. And I can see that kind of appeal as somebody who likes those roots that we have. And some people have said that having the same text on the same Sunday, you can like remember 1 year back and be like, oh yeah, I remember this, and that's helpful for them. I haven't tried to preach. I thought about trying to preach that 1 year lectionary 1 year, and I just haven't like done it yet, but maybe one day. Anyway, so there are some people who like the 1 year lectionary, and they say that a lot of people do say the 3 year lectionary with 4 readings every Sunday is just too much. It's too much, and you can't like remember all of it. Like you've got too much information. It's like overload, and so people come home from church and they can't really remember what the readings were about. Whereas if it maybe had been more focused, it would have been better. And that is one reason why we only use 2 of the 4 in my congregation. It's also just a lot to listen to people read for, pretty good chunks of, maybe a whole chapter or a half a chapter, one after another. In the worship service, we don't have great long attention spans. It's not like the folks who went to hear the Lincoln Douglas debates, for 5 straight hours or whatever. Our presidential debates don't last anything like that long. And that was just a Senate debate. But anyway, so the lectionary tradition, as I said, I've got like kind of a love-hate relationship with it because I like that discipline. I like the challenge of saying, okay, here's some text that I maybe wouldn't have preached on, but let me wrestle with it. Let me pray through it. Let me see what is the word in this text. And I like the ecumenical aspect of it, that I'm reading the same gospel that most likely every Sunday they're reading down the street at Grace Episcopal or up on the hill at Mount Carmel Catholic Church or, around the world, somewhere far away. We're reading the same text, hearing the same word, and that I think helps cultivate a spiritual unity among Christians. I think that's actually pretty cool and pretty attractive. But as a preacher, there are times when you have it on your heart. I want to preach about this topic, or I think something has happened in the world and this is something we really need to talk about, and the lectionary texts for that week just don't really fit. And so for me, I use the lectionary. I typically will preach from the lectionary, but I don't feel shackled to the lectionary, and I feel like, and in the Methodist Church, we kind of have this flexibility with the liturgy and our traditions that maybe Anglicans don't have as much or Roman Catholics don't have as much, where I can say, okay, for these 6 weeks, we're going to follow the lectionary, and then I'm going to do a 4-week series on these topics, and then we're going to come back to the lectionary, and that's kind of the way I've approached it. And even when I've done sermon series, I've tried, when possible, of the 2 readings, to at least have one of them that actually comes from the lectionary that week, and then maybe pull in another one on a thematic basis. And so I've still kind of got one foot in the lectionary tradition, and because of, again, that continuity with other believers and just the appeal of that, and honoring the discipline of the lectionary. Now this year, I have tried to be a little bit more strict with the lectionary since Advent started, and just because I felt like I was in need of that, kind of returning to that discipline. So anyway, if you have any questions about the lectionary, I would love to hear them and maybe could answer them for you a little bit. One thing that is cool about the lectionary, if you know where to look, and there are a lot of websites with the Revised Common Lectionary or the Prayerbook Lectionary on them, you can look ahead and see what the scriptures are going to be for next Sunday and the Sunday after that. And when I first came back into the Methodist Church, I was confirmed in a United Methodist Church as a kid, and then went to some Baptist churches, evangelical, non-denominational type churches, and then in college came back to a United Methodist Church, and every week I got this weekly bulletin, and it said next week's lectionary texts are, and so that would be really my Bible study in the days in between, every day, or I'd focus on one of those texts, or maybe half of one of those texts, and really study them through the week. So by the time I got to Sunday, I think that had kind of plowed the field in my heart, so to speak, to prepare me to hear the sermon on a much deeper level. And so that's something that I really do commend to you as a spiritual practice. We probably don't take as seriously as we should the need to prepare for Sunday worship, and to try to get our hearts and our minds in a condition to really receive what's going to happen on Sunday mornings. And that's reading those lectionary texts ahead of time is a great way to do that. And as a pastor, I probably need to do a better job of putting that out there. Although at our church, if you get those emails from the church office that have all the announcements and everything and what's coming up, every email, it's got a copy of the worship service for the coming Sunday, and there are those scriptures. And you can read them. If you're a member of my church, check that out. Anyway, I'd love to see your questions or comments. What's your experience with the lectionary? Do you love it? You hate it? Not sure? You never heard of it before? Would love to hear about all that in the comments below. Feel free to hit the thumbs up, share this video around, and as always, I pray that the Lord will bless you and keep you and give you his peace. Amen.